Today we're going to talk about page design. We've been looking at individual elements of what goes on a page, but now we're going to focus more on how we put those together. And I'm hoping the example you're looking at right now is a good indication that you can't just throw things on a page, whether it's printed or on the web, and expect that it's going to be useful to people. Here's an example that's not quite as bad as that first one, but again, it's pretty awful. The repeating gradients, the colors that are difficult to read against each other, the icons that I'm not sure what they are. Everything about it pretty much doesn't work. So this lesson is about helping you put the pieces together in a way that works better than these travesties. When we look at page design, we're actually looking at juggling 4 different types of elements. We're looking at headlines, we're looking at text blocks, we're looking at photos, and we're looking at cut lines, which are also sometimes called captions. When we have those pieces, we need to carefully think of how we put them together on the page. And the best way to think about it is to think of stacking elements. Because if we don't do that, we end up with something that looks like one of the web pages at the start of this video. So how do we do that? Well, a good idea is to have a working grid, and on that grid all of our elements should be rectangular. Think of building blocks. It's kind of hard to have building blocks that have all different shapes and sizes to them, whereas if they're all rectangles, very easy to work with. We're going to use that grid, we're going to stack the rectangles, and we're going to do it in a way that emphasizes what's important among them. So a grid is basically the underlying structure of a page. And on a magazine page or a newsletter page, we typically have a 3-column grid. And that's typical because those pages are generally about 8.5 inches wide. And that means each column is a little under 3 inches. If you have more columns than that, you have really narrow columns that can be very hard to read and not that pleasing on the eye. When you move up to a newspaper like the Tower Light or one of the New York tabloids, we get a little bigger format, and very often we'll see a 4-column used here. It's got more flexibility, and we have text blocks that are easy to read. We'll also see those sometimes tabloids using 5 columns. And when we get to the bigger newspapers, like the New York Times, Washington Post, etc., we call those broadsheets, and they're typically set on a 6-column grid. There's an outlier here, 7 columns, and it's useful in some limited applications, but pretty much if you look at the 3-column, the 5-column, and the 6-column, you have your tools you need, whether you're designing magazine and newsletters, a tabloid page, or a broadsheet page. So we also can go more than 6 or 7 columns though, and here we have examples of 10 and 12 columns, but rarely do we use 1 column by itself. Typically we combine columns. So even though on this 12-column model, for instance, we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 wider columns and 1 narrow column. So what we have there are 4 columns that are actually made up of 2 columns each, and then one that's made up of 3 columns, and then one that's made up of 1 columns. And you put it all together and you got 12, but there's only one that's 1/12 the size of the page here. So let's start with simple examples. I said that we should imagine that each part of the page is a rectangle. And right now, forgetting about things like art or cut lines, just looking at headlines and text, we have an example here on the left that just takes 3 identical packages, 3 rectangles, and puts them one above another. It's good in the fact that it's easy to see which story is which story without having headlines run into each other, etc. But it's really boring. The middle example, we've taken one of those stories and we moved it over to the right and given it its own column. And the headlines for the top left story and top right story do bump each other, but because we have a different size on the headlines and maybe one of them we've gone italic with, for instance, it gives it more interest on the page. And we could also flip this page around and put that one column that's on the right now over on the left. You see things like that all the time. The last example here, we have possibly the most interesting one because we don't have the repetition we have in the first two. And we have headlines that do bump each other, but again, they're different sizes, they're different number of lines, etc. So we've got some variety here. So that's one of the things we want to think about. We want to vary the shape and size of the rectangle. Some will be horizontal, some will be vertical, some will be squares. We want to think in some cases about putting a box around a story. And we want to think about other things like sidebars and skyscrapers and different headline treatments. These are kinds of advanced for right now, but we'll see as we move along what these things mean. So now we have 4 more examples, and these are all marked good because even though we still haven't really incorporated art into the main part of the page, except for the top right one, there's a lot of variety here. And notice none of them are anything except a rectangle. Beginning designers end up, in many cases, having page elements look more like the letter L, either standing upright or turned on its side. And that's just not appealing. If we can have it look more like one of these, that every story, every package is its own rectangle, it's much better here. Notice how we've used boxing on some of the stories to make them interesting. Notice how we've used lines, which we call rules, on some of the pages, either vertically or horizontally. Notice how on the bottom right one, we've got briefs in that dark black line. All these things are techniques we can use to make our pages more interesting. So now that we've talked about the overall page structure and how we use grids to ensure that the structure is pleasing to the eye, let's talk a little bit about the elements that go onto the page in those grids. And the first thing we're going to talk about is art. Now, art is kind of a fancy way to say photos and graphics, including infographics. And so we are visual creatures, and especially in the last couple of decades where we've spent a lot of our time looking at things on the web and watching videos. So we want to make sure that a well-designed print page is somewhere around 1/3 of it or more devoted to art. But just like we don't want to have a mess like we saw in those first couple examples today, we also want to make sure that there's one dominant piece of art on each page. This is what designer Mario Garcia calls the center of visual interest. It can be any type of art, but it has to be played big. And while it can go anywhere on the page, there are places on the page that it makes more sense because we're going to use that to help direct the eye on its journey through the page. So we need to have a balance, and we also need to have art throughout the page. We don't want to just shove it in a corner somewhere. So here are some examples, weak and good, with providing a dominant image. The first one, top left, the top right photo and bottom left photo, kind of the same size, so there's no clear center of visual interest here. Whereas the one next to it, the upper right, it's very clear where the designer wants us to start looking on this page. And then there's also a progression from there. We look at that, we come down to the small photo on the right, and then we bump down to the bottom left. The examples on the bottom show us good and bad examples of balancing and scattering the art on the page. The first one, we definitely have a strong image up top, but then we have a small one next to it, and we have three pretty much the same size down below, kind of right next to each other, but not really. Whereas in the revised version next to it, we've separated those in a couple of different ways. And so now we have a better balanced page here. We also have to have headlines on a page. Every story has to have a headline, and the headline should be touching the text on the story. We do not want to have art of any sort between a headline on the story. It's very confusing to readers. Headlines don't take a lot of words because we're going to use large typefaces for our headlines. The largest at the top, smaller as we go down the page. But we only get 5 to 10 words on most headlines. And that's not a whole lot, so every word has to count as we're setting up our headlines. One of the most fun and interesting parts of page design is using display headlines. Here we're not just taking text and changing the size or color, etc., but we're actually being very creative, and we're looking for something that matches the tone of the story, and we don't want to be too gimmicky with it, but we want to have something that catches the reader's eye. Now, sticking with one font is a real important idea, and you can see in all of these examples we have just one font used, but different sizes, different shadows, different outlines, different coloration, etc. And you can see there's a very clear grid within the display headline itself. Words aren't just thrown randomly here. So all of these are much more powerful than if we just took these 4 words and just used normal typeface with them. We have to make sure we're matching the tone though. As you can see in these examples, Jungle Jamboree, that typeface doesn't really do anything. But the 2 typefaces picked for the revision give us a sense of some fun. Living with AIDS, that first one looks like fun, and it's not. So we have to be more serious with this one. Gimmicky, we have on the bottom left, is God dead? And that typeface not only is almost impossible to read, but it's a cliche. Too many things going on at once and Love to be Wild. Trying to play around with letters on the third one. Is it Sunday cool or Sunday schooly, or it's hard to say what that is. And using bars in the final one, it makes me want to read the material that's in the brown bars by itself and then read the other letters by themselves, and it just doesn't make sense if we do that. Of course, a large part of any page is going to be the text blocks on it, and we need to keep a couple of things in mind here. Generally speaking, depending on the typefaces used, we'll use type that's between 8-point and 12-point type. And we'll think about the varying amounts of leading we might want to have working with the different sizes of the type. We want to be consistent. We don't want to have different typefaces in all the different text boxes on a page. While at the same time, we kind of have a little variety with bold, italic, etc., but just in small doses. And if we're doing stories on a newsletter or a newspaper page, we don't want to have the story continue on another page. That's called a jump, unless there's a significant amount of content available to jump. We don't want to have the reader have to go to another part of the magazine or newsletter or newspaper to find there's one sentence left there. Now, the one element we haven't talked about is photos. And photos, you know the saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, good pictures are. There are lots of bad pictures out there, and they're growing exponentially since everyone now has a camera on their phone. So pick photos that tell stories for us, that actually say something. If people in the photo or action in the photo is moving in a direction, place the photo on the page in a way that that direction directs the reader's eyes onto the page and not off it. If you have to choose because of limitations on space between a couple of small photos and one big one, always go with the big one. And if you do have more than one, make sure one of them is dominant, as we talked about before. And we also need to think about cut lines, and every photo should have a cut line. That is 1 or 2 lines of explanatory text, what's going on in the photo, who the people are in the photo, some background on it, etc. A couple of other things to think about when we're thinking about visual elements of the page. First is that sometimes visual elements can actually be created from text, and one of the most common things we see are pull quotes. And here we're looking for quotes within the text of an article, and ones that are very interesting, ones that aren't that long, and ones that can be played up in a box in the story to break up the main text itself. So pull quotes are very interesting as a graphical element on the page. The other graphical thing to think about are rules and boxes. Rules, I've mentioned before here, are just lines. They can be used horizontally or vertically. And boxes, just what it sounds like. We can use them around stories, around graphics, around photos, etc. So both of these are things that can add visual appeal to our pages as well. So it might seem like we have a lot of rules to follow when we design pages. And indeed we do. But within that set of rules, it's important that we're creative, because we want to design pages that are stylish and don't just look like cookie cutter renderings of other pages that we see all the time. So once you understand the principles and work with them, you can bend the rules a little bit to make things more interesting. Don't forget that photos and other graphics are very important, and play around with display headlines. Use some of your knowledge of different typefaces to try something that's maybe a little out of your comfort zone, but is much more visually interesting. But at the same time, it's always important to remember we need to match the tone of the content. We don't want to have something that is wildly inappropriate for the story that we're trying to tell here.